I have to recount an issue I ran into last week that I think anyone buying or selling a home needs to understand. Normally, when a buyer submits their earnest money, it's their broker who holds on to it. If the deal falls apart, that broker is responsible for interpreting the contract and determining who that money goes to. In other words, based on what the contract says, does it go back to the buyer, or have they lost it because they're outside their contingencies and the contract says the seller gets to keep that earnest money? Well, there's another option where instead of the broker holding that earnest money, the closing attorney holds it. I'm not even sure why this exists. I guess because some brokerages don't have their own trust accounts. It requires a little more paperwork and the closing attorney has to agree to hold the buyer's earnest money. Simple enough. But my broker is always telling us that this is a bad idea. And now I understand why. Let me explain. According to the standard Georgia GAR contract, if the closing attorney holds the earnest money, they get to decide who gets the money, and they get to take as long as they want to decide this. It doesn't even matter how they interpret the contract, which is one reason you don't want them holding the money. Some brokers believe that the closing attorneys aren't as familiar with the contracts and can easily decide incorrectly. The closing attorney can also decide that they don't want to make this determination and instead interplead the funds, which means they ask a judge to make the decision. So I had a transaction terminate last week. The closing attorneys had the $4,000 earnest money. They called to tell me that they weren't going to make the decision and instead interplead the funds. Why? Because it was a cash transaction. And in a cash transaction, the closing attorney actually represents the buyer. In a finance transaction where the buyer is getting a loan, the closing attorney doesn't represent either side. They represent the lender. So because the closing attorney was technically representing the buyer, they didn't feel it was fair for them to decide who gets the earnest money. They also said they would not interplead the funds unless both sides agreed to this. Finally, they said it was in everyone's best interest to reach an agreement. For example, split the $4,000 50-50. My clients agreed. The buyer did not. Well, this is the worst possible scenario. Why? First, it costs $1,500 just to file with the court and another $500 on top of that. So you've used up $2,000 of the earnest money right off the bat. Second, the losing party can be held responsible for paying all the legal fees. This is just crazy. What client wants to go to court, possibly lose this fight, and then have to pay all the legal fees? None that I know of. They would get none of the earnest money they were fighting for and actually owe money instead. Given our scenario, it became clear after a few days that all the buyer had to do was 1, not agree to go to court, and 2, dig her heels in and refuse to split the money 50-50. In that scenario, despite what the closing attorney said about not making the decision, they would either make the decision or move forward with the court making the decision. I seriously doubt they would put both parties in this risky court position and would ultimately most likely decide on some type of equitable split. So despite them saying they weren't going to make this decision, the buyer could have easily forced their hand. In the end, the buyer caved, and my clients are getting $2,000 as part of the agreement. So never, ever, ever let the closing attorney hold the earnest money if you don't want to end up in a situation as complicated as this one. If the buy side doesn't have a brokerage account, have the sell side's broker hold it. As strange as that might sound, it's still a million times better than giving that money to a closing attorney. On a side note, the buyer terminated 6 days prior to closing. On the form, she checked the fourth option, something labeled, quote, other unlawful reason, end quote, whatever that means, and then spelled out her reason, quote, unacceptable behavior by seller during property visit, end quote. Well, first, who knows what unlawful reason means? There was nothing in the contract defining this. And second, unacceptable behavior is a highly subjective term. I won't go into details, but let's just say the buy side showed up to measure for furniture and stayed twice as long as was agreed to, and it almost ended with a fistfight. Since I wasn't there to protect my clients, I did my part and called the police to intervene. The non-emergency number, of course, but I don't think they ever showed up. Every day I spend selling real estate is a new adventure. You never know what you're going to run into.